want to first thank Principal Ma'am and Dr. Milan Janoman for having me here. I would also like to extend my thanks to all the faculty and the students that have attended, and to mention my gratitude towards Sofia Salas from the Embassy of Costa Rica in India and Livia Jyoti Mukhopadhyay of Indo Hispanic Language Academy for making this possible. It is a long-time dream of mine to come here and share some of the things that we do related to India, its language and literatures. And it is an honor for me to be here sharing with you this today. Let me begin by telling you a brief story about myself. In the year 2008, I was about to finish my undergraduate studies at the University of Costa Rica. I was pursuing a degree in classical philology, which in Costa Rica, I believe very accurately, does not limit itself to the Greek and Latin classics, as sometimes European or North American universities do. But there, the ancient and classical traditions of the West are studied alongside those of the East, and this is something that is owed to an old professor of ours, Professor Hilda Chenapuy, who was responsible for this wide worldview and this open-mindedness, which has led us into having a very long-lasting and strong tradition of Indian studies in Costa Rica. So in this year 2008, I am taking my beginning courses in Sanskrit, and my professor invited me to a course entitled Sanskrit Literature. I was intrigued about such a broad name for a course, and in fact, the course offers an overview, starting with Rig Veda and moving on almost until the 12th century CE. Over the course of one semester, the students there, we had the opportunity to read in Spanish translation some of the best known productions of this wonderful literature. And I remember enjoying very much the Vedic literature, but it was when I first arrived to the Mahabharata that something really resonated with me then. My professor noticed that, and I remember having a discussion with her and telling her these stories, these messages really speak to me on a different level, and to a degree they remind me some of the things that I know and that I have studied from the Greek classics that I have been reading over the past years. Would you mind if I try and make some comparisons with these two traditions? And she encouraged me to. And this is part of the things that I am going to be speaking about in my lecture today, and I am so glad to be able to do this in a department of comparative literature, because the Mahabharata is largely studied and understood from a comparative perspective in Costa Rica. So this would be some interesting preamble to the words that I am going to be sharing with you. Let me first answer what probably is the question that has arisen among many of you: why the Mahabharata and why Costa Rica? These two ideas at first may appear distant and unrelated, but let me make this relationship clear. With its little more than 50,000 square kilometers of surface, Costa Rica, which is Spanish for rich coast, is smaller than West Bengal. Located in the antipodes of the Indian Ocean, some 10 degrees north of the equator, Costa Rica's latitude is like that of Kerala, whose year-round average temperature of between 20 and 30 degrees Celsius is... Yes. Can you hear me better now? Okay. Sorry for that. So Costa Rica's latitude is like that of Kerala, whose year-round average temperature of between 20 and 30 degrees Celsius it also happens to share. Costa Rica's history is progressively linked to Columbus's exploration and subsequent colonization of what he called the West Indies, to the viceroyalty of New Spain, and to the export-oriented economy of other Central American nations. During the last 3 decades, Costa Rica has also seen an exponential growth in terms of technology industry and its outsourcing demands. But apart from these rather coincidental points of encounter, what is the cultural link between India and Costa Rica? Or to put it another way, how can one speak about the Mahabharata in Costa Rica? This paper focuses on the role that the Mahabharata, as a masterpiece of world literature, has played over the past century in Costa Rica, mainly among scholars at the university level, but also among the wider population. To that end, 3 sections are offered, covering first the availability of the Mahabharata, whether in its entirety or in the form of isolated sections, as reading material for the Spanish-speaking public of Costa Rica. Second, the research on the Mahabharata coming from the University of Costa Rica, as well as the different perspectives about the text that it has taken. And third, the telling detail of the staging of the play Battlefield, which is based on Mahabharata, to commemorate 120 years since the inauguration of the National Theatre of Costa Rica. Section 1, the Mahabharata as the first book from Sanskrit literature in Costa Rica. In 1924, in the Journal of the National University of Córdoba, Argentina, the Savitri-Bukiana featured as the first Sanskrit to Spanish translation in Latin America. So this is a landmark. Sanskrit literature had been previously and very briefly translated to Spanish in Spain. The first translations were about Kalidas's plays, Vikram Urvashiam and Abhijnana Shakuntalam. Those were the first Spanish translations. But Savitri-Upakhana is the first Latin American translation, as well as the first Mahabharata translation to Spanish. This contribution was made in Argentina by Professor Konrad Freundlich. This is a German professor who lived in Argentina and taught there at the University of Córdoba. Just a year later, in 1925, Freundlich's article, including both the translation and its foreword, was republished in Costa Rica through 2 separate venues. One of them was the cultural journal called Repertorio Americano, which in English can be translated as American Repertoire. This was the largest cultural journal of Costa Rica in the early 20th century, and it also circulated widely among other Latin American countries. The other venue was the publishing group called El Convivio, meaning something like the Regal Press. They were both edited by a Costa Rican educator called Joaquin Garcia Monge, and they were both aimed at the general public. This is also something interesting about these beginnings of Mahabharata in Costa Rica. I was talking briefly about this early in the morning, and in Costa Rica's case, it was not the filmic version by Peter Brook that first introduced Mahabharata, but rather this translation made in Argentina, which was valued by this Costa Rican publisher and educator, and he decided to include it in these 2 venues, one cultural journal and one publishing group. This academic journal, Repertorio Americano, by those years, also features several entries or articles about Rabindranath Tagore. So this was also the medium through which modern or some of the modern literature from India was introduced to the Costa Rican audience. Freundlich's introduction to the story of Savitri became, for the Costa Rican audience, a sort of overall presentation of the Mahabharata, which largely determined the way that the text would be understood from then on. For instance, his definition of the Mahabharata as, I quote, national Hindu epic, this is Freundlich's introduction. This might have had something to do with the placement in Costa Rican libraries and curricula alike of the text alongside other, quote, national epics, unquote, such as the Iliad, the Odyssey, or the Aeneid. And his appreciation, Freundlich's, of the Mahabharata as the, and I quote again, longest poetic work in world literature, end quote, could have informed the tendency to consider the text as nearly unfathomable when taken as a whole, and in consequence to try and focus only on some of its episodes, like the Nalopakyana, the Savitri Upakyana, or the Bhagavad Gita. Let me now mention another quotation from this paper by Freundlich. The aforementioned episodes, the three that I have just referred to, do not have a direct link to the main action of the epic, and they are told only incidentally as instructive examples of the heroes of the Mahabharata, end quote. Freundlich's own knowledge of the Mahabharata came from Western scholars. In his foreword, he cites a couple of opinions about the text coming from the German Indologist Theodor Pempfel and from the German mechanical engineer Franz Poirot, whose book, A Journey Across India in 1881, he even quotes. Such background accounts for his favoring of the paradigm that by the early 20th century was widely dominant in the West, and that tended to explain these episodes as interpolations. Again, quoting from Freundlich's introduction, presumably both episodes, now he's just speaking about the Savitri Upakyana and Nalopakyana, both episodes already existed as independent poetic pieces when they were incorporated into the Mahabharata, and they both are extremely popular because of their poetic beauty and because of the moral value of their content, end quote. When looking panoramically at Freundlich's contribution, the good certainly outweighs the bad. Not only is he very open about his admiration of the Mahabharata, especially regarding the Savitri Upakyana, but also he is quite conscious about his pivotal role in making this work of art available to a contemporary audience. He says, quote, I have decided to contribute to the knowledge of the literary jewel entitled Savitri. By the way, this is the description that accompanied the Costa Rican translation. It appeared as Savitri, una joya literaria, a literary jewel, an episode of the Mahabharata, un episodio del Mahabharata. So, continuing with the quote, I decided to contribute to the knowledge of this literary jewel by translating it directly from Sanskrit into Spanish, a very common practice back in the day. I am talking late 19th and early 20th century, both in Latin America and in Spain, was to translate Sanskrit literature not from the original Sanskrit but from other European translations. So many Mahabharata translations first appeared either in Latin, German, or English, and later on French as well, and some Latin American and Spanish academics from back in the day translated from the modern languages into Spanish, which was a practice. It is not something that is done so much now, but it used to happen. Freundlich is also responsible for providing what was probably the first bird's-eye view of the Mahabharata's plot to the Latin American lay public. The introduction says, one of these, he's referring to the Pandava heroes, is Yudhishthira, a king who lost his throne and his kingdom on account of gambling, and who finds himself compelled to live with his 4 brothers and with Draupadi, the king's wife, in the depths of the forest for 12 years. I have been researching this subject for some years now, and I believe this is the first plot summary, very, very brief plot summary of the Mahabharata that was available in Costa Rica, and probably the second one in the whole of Latin America. So some of these ideas had to do with how the text was perceived and interpreted, received from the Rome. Something similar about Freundlich's role can be said about the history-based approach that he takes. Another quote. Other one of those, he's referring to historical wars, motivated by the Aryan tribes of the Pandavas when they arrived during their migration at the banks of the Ganges, earned itself the name of quote-unquote big war. And this is precisely the basis of the great poem's action, or if preferred, of the collection of historical songs known as the Mahabharata. This was also very common then to try and relate the deeds of the Mahabharata with some historical deeds. That was a Western view that Freundlich transmitted to his translation and that he incorporated into his introduction. Freundlich's part in the story about the Mahabharata in Costa Rica comes to an end with his own acknowledgement of the difficulties inherent in the work of an early 20th century Latin American Indologist. Quote, regarding a previous Spanish version of the episode at hand, I have not been able to confirm, despite the most extensive inquiries and the most rigorous bibliographic study, the existence of any. End quote. All the necessary resources were simply not there yet. So these are the beginnings. In the next section, I am going to be discussing the Mahabharata as the most researched subject from Sanskrit literature in Costa Rica. At the University of Costa Rica, Sanskrit is taught at the classical philology department, alongside languages like ancient Greek and Latin. Likewise, Sanskrit literature is studied by people who are also learning about the Greco-Roman world. Given that traditionally some Western universities have only recognized as classics the European ones, it is noteworthy that in the remote Central America, Sanskrit has had continuously and since 1968 the attention that it most certainly deserves. 1968 was the year in which the first Sanskrit course was offered at the University of Costa Rica. Furthermore, when considering in tandem the increasing disparagement of the Greco-Roman classics and the sustained efforts directed towards a Sanskrit revival, one can only agree with the Roman historian Sallust, who famously wrote, Concordia parvae res crescunt, discordia maximae dilabuntur. This is Latin for, in agreement, small things grow. In disagreement, big ones fall apart. Even though the Spanish translation of the Savitli-Upakhana was followed by one of the Nalopakhyana, by several of the Bhagavad Gita, and by an abridged version of the Mahabharata itself, which became readily available at libraries and bookstores in San Jose, the capital of Costa Rica. Still, the scholarly interest in the text came much later. When I mentioned these translations, the Spanish translation of Nalopakhyana dates from 1987 and it was published in Spain. And the most recent translation, Spanish translation of Savitli-Upakhana is from 1998, also from Spain. The first article dealing with the Mahabharata in Costa Rica is from the year 2000. That is, from 75 years later than the first translation. It is not a coincidence that this article deals with the story of Savitri, and neither is the fact that in the early 21st
21st century Costa Rica of its author, Sol Arguello Escriva, much like in the early 20th century Argentina of Conrad Freundlich, the resources were scarce. Here I quote from Sol Arguello Escriva's article, an article on Savitri. It is worth noting the difficulties in the realization of this paper, among which is the fact that Indian epic literature comes from a non-Western culture, and this complicates the research and the gathering of bibliography, whether because it is not available in the country or because what is available at the libraries is not enough." End quote. In the few Latin American countries where Sanskrit language and literature have been taught, the endeavor has always started as a one-person job. A case in point is Costa Rican Indologist Hilda Chenapuy, whose pioneering work was then continued by Sol Arguello Escriva, not only by means of what she had learned from her mentor, but also through the specialized books coming from Chenapuy's personal library, which were donated to the main library of the University of Costa Rica. However, as complete as it might be, a personal collection is never the same as a library collection. The situation would eventually improve thanks to both new acquisitions by the university library and progressively available online materials. This is why, from the year 2000 onwards, research on Mahabharata has increased exponentially in Costa Rica. Online resources and library acquisitions. One of the most recent ones was the first Spanish translation of the entire Mahabharata. Unfortunately, it is not a direct Sanskrit to Spanish translation. This is still missing, and I hope that sometime soon I am going to be sharing the news that we have managed to pull that off together in collaboration with several Latin American universities, but it still does not exist. What we have now is a Spanish translation of Ganguly's English translation of the Mahabharata. And this comes in 12 volumes and was recently acquired by the University of Costa Rica. It was published in Argentina. So by listening to some of these details, historical and cultural details that I'm sharing with you, you may identify the key points in the Latin American milieu that have to do with Sanskrit studies and Mahabharata studies, mainly Argentina, Costa Rica, Mexico as well. Over the past decade or so, research on Mahabharata has significantly improved in Costa Rica. There are two more articles by Arguello Escriva, both from the year 2015. Let me just read the titles. One of them is Damayanti, From Victim to Heroine or Proof of Loyalty. The paper and most of these papers are written in Spanish. I have just translated the titles so that I can share with you what they are about. The other one is The Permanence of Female Images in Epic Texts in India. This article does not deal only with Mahabharata, but also with Ramayana. The first article, the one about Damayanti, dealing with this story of Nala, and the other about some shared features between Mahabharata and Ramayana. The publication about the Nalopakyana highlights the character of Damayanti, whose role in the story ends up being decisive, and whose demeanor inside the narrative has some major implications outside the epic itself. The first feature that stands out is the fact that the subject matter is presented comparatively. With a solid background in the Greco-Roman classics, Sol Arguello, the author, opts for presenting the text through some comparisons, which, it might be worth noticing, tend to stress the differences rather than the similarities. I believe this is not something that I necessarily need to say here, but Comparisons are always about two things, not only finding similarities but also differences. That is the essence of comparative endeavors. For instance, the Sanskrit text is characterized as abounding in descriptions, which are also a trademark of the Greek epics. Nonetheless, the Sanskrit epic goes well beyond the somewhat monotonous characterizations through epithets, which in the Iliad or the Odyssey usually reduce each character to a space, reduce each character or space to a handful of formulaic qualifiers. In fact, epithets do play a role in the Mahabharata, but therein, the descriptions are not limited to those uses, the ones that we see in Greek epics, as can be easily proven by just pointing in the direction of the Nalupakya's forest descriptions. Just like the epithets, the divine interventions are also to be found in both literary traditions. In this sense, the difference is that the gods from Mahabharata factor in issues of piety and morality, whereas their Greek counterparts act only according to their favoritisms. Two quotes from Sol Arguello Escriva's paper about Nalupakya. It is an interpolated narration with abundant physical descriptions of the nature and the characters, not like in the Greek epic genre, as is known in the West, where epic epithets abound. And the other quote, Damayanti, just like the other women of the Mahabharata, lives in a world of warriors, envies, and excessive ambitions, where the gods participate not in the same way as the Greek gods of the Iliad and the Odyssey, but by helping the pious and those who invoke them. End quote. Another salient feature is the article's philological approach. Arguello Escriva also has a background in philology, a discipline that tackles texts not only from the point of view of language and literature, but also from those of mythology and symbolism, or of more recent scholarly paradigms such as gender studies. This is why throughout the article one finds explanations like, quote, the word Damayanti, which gives name to this character and at the same time is a feminine present participle from the root dam, to domesticate, to tame, end quote. Alongside other explanations like, quote, the cutting of the sari, which symbolizes the marital union, end quote. Or one final quotation, Damayanti can be considered as a socially constructed model, an archetype of the ideal woman, the ever-faithful wife, even in adversity, end quote. Since much of this research has been carried on and published in Spanish, I believe it is important to share some of it, at least in English, and to an English-speaking public, even more so to a public from here, to let it be made known how the text is interpreted back there. In her insightful conclusions, the author, Arguello Escriva, manages to set aside all these hermeneutical tools, and she offers an explanation of the characters within the text that could awaken the interest of Indian and Western readers alike. A case in point is her reading of Nala, who, according to her, keeps transforming as the narrative advances. And in those changes, the hero's physical appearance is to be interpreted as an equivalent for his social standing. Thus, this tale of recovery goes beyond the tangible, which is phrased in terms of the kingdom, and it manages to reach the impalpable. One quote about her view of Nala. Other is the journey of the hero Nala, who undergoes 3 transformations. 1. Nala is naked and without any true status, dressed in women's clothing. 2. Nala is lowered in stature and social status. And 3. Nala returns to the figure of a handsome man, and the recovery of his status begins thanks to his fidelity as a husband. End quote. The other article by Arguello Escriva, the one that compares Mahabharata and Ramayana, Hector and Arjuna Karna, two visions of epic heroism. This one is dedicated to a comparative study of only those two Sanskrit characters, Arjuna and Karna. The general subject of life and death is given a particularized treatment, as the article highlights the questioning of the heroic ideals that both epics incorporate. Without a doubt, living and dying in the Mahabharata is not the same as in the Homeric epics, where there is no notion of transcendence other than the literature itself. There is nothing even close to moksha in the Iliad. Both epic traditions share the notion of an idealized death. In Greece, dying in the flower of one's youth, in the front line, at the hands of a worthy opponent. In the Sanskrit text, dying in the battlefield, laying on a bed of arrows. In addition, they both include a questioning of said idealization. Achilles in the Iliad prefers life over death, and in the Odyssey he would even be willing to trade the best treatment in death for the worst one while still living. Arjuna in the Mahabharata learns from Krishna that life and death are ultimately the same, for the only permanent thing is the union with the Absolute. End quote. As of today, the situation of Mahabharata studies in Costa Rica is significantly better. In 2018, Costa Rica contributed with its first scholar at the World Sanskrit Conference, presenting a paper in the epics section. In 2021, the Shakuntala Upakhana was taught as part of the Intermediate Sanskrit 1 course at the University of Costa Rica. That same year, the university's main library acquired the first unabridged, although not direct translation of the Mahabharata into Spanish, made available in 12 volumes by the Argentinian publishing group Hastinapur. In 2022, a group of 4 Costa Rican undergraduates started their dissertation on, quote, women and paradigms of femininity in the sub-stories of the Mahabharata. Shakuntala, Devayani, Sharmishta, Bhadra, Tapati, Angirasi, Shukanya. In translation, the faithful wife, Pativrata, Savitri, Amba, also in translation, the old maiden, Vardakumari, Madhavi and Sulabha. And in 2023, a postgraduate course on the Mahabharata will be offered for the first time as part of the master's program in classical literature. The aim of the Mahabharata course, as per its outline, is to analyze, based on Indian culture and Sanskrit literary terminology, the Mahabharata as a representative of Sanskrit epic literature. To that end, it follows 3 objectives: contextualizing the Mahabharata from a historical, religio-philosophical, mythical, and linguistic point of view, to fathom a literary approach toward it. 2, understanding the Mahabharata as a work of itihasa, through a contrast with the Western classification of literary genres, with the purpose of valuing its aesthetical background. And 3, studying the main events and characters of the Mahabharata based on close readings of selected passages, with the intention of comprehending its significance in Indian culture and Sanskrit literatures. As seen, the goal is to tackle the text by means of its own culture and concepts. However, to achieve that, one must undertake the necessary steps. The first one is the recognition of several, albeit still Western, point of views, such as that of history, religion, philosophy, mythology, and linguistics. The second one is trying to turn the etic into the imic by looking at other literary typologies, such as the one surrounding the concept of itihasa, which brings together phenomena that are elsewhere regarded as dichotomous. The close reading that serves as a last step is then the culmination of a process that has come full circle. The Mahabharata is, in this sense, a window into Indian cultures, through which Costa Rican graduate students can enjoy the cross-cultural education that this modern globalized time so urgently required from them. Now for the last section of this talk, the Mahabharata, as the guest of honor in the 120th anniversary of the inauguration of the National Theatre of Costa Rica. On October the 19th, 1897, the opera Faust by French composer Charles Gounod was chosen for the official inauguration of the National Theatre of Costa Rica. With its Pompeian-style vestibule, its academic art-style mural entitled Allegory of Coffee and the Banana, those were the main two products of export products in late 19th century Costa Rica, coffee and banana. And with its various statues, including the neoclassical style ones of Spanish dramatist Pedro Calderón de la Barca and of the German composer Ludwig van Beethoven, as well as the Art Deco style one entitled The Flutist by Costa Rican sculptor Jorge Jiménez de Heredia. Everything in this building, the National Theatre of Costa Rica, recalls Western artistic traditions. Nonetheless, when on October 18th and 19th, 2017, as a celebration of the anniversary of said inauguration, the theatre's authorities organized a commemorative staging, a Mahabharata-inspired play was selected. Battlefield, a play adapted and directed by English director Peter Brook and French playwright Marie-Hélène Etienne, was advertising Costa Rica under the slogan, "We are all a field of battle," which clearly alludes to the Kurukshetra Dharmakshetra polysemy. In a one-hour staging, the play flashes through around one-third of the Mahabharata's narrative. It focuses on the aftermath of the war, as well as on all that can and should be learned following such dire circumstances. Like Yudhishthira, we all face impossible choices and are left to make do amidst their repercussions. A war of cosmological dimensions, such as the one in the Mahabharata, might not strike the right chord in a country like Costa Rica, which has managed to subsist without an army since its abolition in 1948. Nevertheless, suffering at the personal level and at the family level is something that would certainly resound anywhere at any time. This universality of the play, which is doubtless the result of a reverential adaptation of the same feature from the epic, was praised in a newspaper article serving as a presentation of the staging. And I quote from the newspaper article. Peter Brook's Battlefield is exceptional in its production and its treatment of the subject matter, for it does not leave us indifferent, and it allows for us to reflect upon the catastrophic consequences of war. Who wins and who loses after a war? This is the question, based on a centuries-long Indian context, but still valid nowadays, end quote. Regardless of the so-called Orientalism for which he has been severely criticized, Peter Brook's contribution to the West, Costa Rica included, is not that different from the one of Konrad Freundlich discussed at the beginning of this paper. The how might be questionable, but the why comes from a good place. Not to mention that the what, that is the fact that a centuries-old Sanskrit epic has found its way into 21st century Costa Rican milieu, much like it did over time all over Southeast Asia, is a wonder in itself. And it is precisely with this sense of adbhuta that we wish to bring these reflections to an end. Dhanyavad.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Harley. That was a really enlightening lecture, and not just because of the excellent analytical perspectives you pointed out, but also as I was listening to you as you were reading the two ancient cultures, Sanskrit and Greek, together, I was being strongly reminded of our teacher, the legendary scholar, Professor Shishir Kumar Dash. who had attempted this kind of study and to whom we often refer in our class. So I believe this is not just an analysis of the Mahabharata or would offer us a different perspective on reading Mahabharata, but also we could think of how we want to do our comparative literature. From that perspective also this lecture can be extremely important. And also thank you, Professor Harley, for taking us through the intricacies of such a Herculean research work. And it's not an easy task, obviously, as you pointed out, to trace resources, to have access to the original texts, and then to read those texts from our context. These are all extremely important and also extremely difficult tasks, which Professor Harley pointed out. So with that, I would now open this lecture for discussion. Anyone who has any questions, comments, would like to interact with Professor Harley?